In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made a specialty jig, which is essentially a clamp which allowed me to successfully clamp these long miters. Now, as you can see in this clip, I had a little bit of help because I decided to put lock miters on these corners, so the miter joint's not going to slide on me when I apply glue to it. But in general, this could be a really difficult way to clamp material, these long miters, without the proper technique and materials. So I just mocked up a picture frame real quick to kind of emphasize why bar clamps don't work on these miter joints. When you apply pressure, bar clamps are just designed to work perpendicularly to a joint. They apply pressure that way. But unfortunately, the miter joints are on a 45-degree angle, so when you go to apply pressure, they just want to slide against each other. An easy way to offset this problem, you make these simple notches in scrap wood and clamp them across the joint, so that is now going to apply perpendicular pressure to that miter and hold it in place. Now, I just screwed these on real quick. You could see I was showing you how you could clamp these in place for something like a picture frame. I was just mocking this up for the video, but this process does use a lot of clamps. But you can see once everything is applied, it pulls those miters perfectly close, gets everything aligned. Now, this jig in these joints will not fix miscut miters. If you have splined miters, lock miters, any sort of miter that is not cut perfectly on flat stock, no matter how much you clamp it, it is not going to pull it together properly. So that is something of note. Now, obviously, the picture frame is an easy fix. My problem was I had this 6-foot long carcass by about 3 feet tall and 19 feet deep, and I had long lock miters on each of the corners. I had to be able to find a way to clamp all those pieces together. So I kind of combined a couple of designs I've seen before. The reason I mocked all this up was because I didn't want to spend money on something that wouldn't work. I had a theory in my head which I thought would work pretty well by incorporating those jigs with threaded rod to hold everything in place, but that's what that was, a mock-up. And the nice thing about that is you could see what works, what doesn't work for the final product. So I was making these nicely for a jig. I didn't want to spend a ton of time on this, but it was also something I know I could use for other applications. So I wanted to make something that I could utilize for multiple purposes, not just this one project, because making jigs can take a lot of time. Luckily, I had some cabinet grade ply laying around the shop from the project I just did, which was a built-in. You end up with a lot of these smaller offcuts, which I could use to make all of my pieces, so I didn't have to spend money on lumber. You don't have to use this with cabinet grade ply. I just like it because you get less splinters with it. It's obviously a nicer product as well at the end of the day, but it's not necessary. So I ripped all this stuff down and cut it down to about 7 inches wide, and it's 2 inches thick. And then I had a couple extra pieces of scrap, which is what I made the picture frame ones out of. So this is 64 pieces, and I'm doubling them up, so it's going to end up being 32. The reason I'm doubling it up is because one of the reasons I chose plywood is because each consecutive layer of ply is laminated perpendicularly to each other, so it comes out as really strong, dimensionally stable product because the plies are so thin. And on top of that, it's going to be much cheaper, inexpensive than hardwood. I doubled it up because it is only 3/4 inch ply. I'm only going about halfway down my material with my notches, so I wasn't necessarily nervous about them breaking off, but it is a shop, stuff gets stings, some stuff gets kicked around. I wanted plenty of material for the clamps to clamp onto and not have to worry about this stuff breaking, so that is why I decided to double them up. And then all I did was, you saw I roughly drew out my dimensions. Like I said, because I had that original jig, I knew I wanted my pieces smaller, because since I'm clamping all 4 corners, especially the sides, if my pieces were too long, they would hit each other. And then I basically just went through, tilted my blade to 45 degrees, got my cross-cut sled out, and I was using this first piece of wood, as you could see, to mark where all of my cuts are going to be. And then I'm basically just cutting 45s and making little notches. Those notches create the new angle that the clamps can now clamp onto and get your grip strength across that miter. So I decided to go with 2 notches because I was already cutting these. This really wasn't that much work. And anyone who has ever clamped stuff knows that sometimes even something as simple as changing where you're applying pressure can help close a joint or help get rid of a cup. So I figured I'd add 2 notches. If I never use it, it's not that big of a deal, but it's there if I need it. And as you could see, it was just a series of going through and cutting all of these pieces. And then that is what that finished piece looks like. Now I decided to change up the design a little bit by adding a threaded rod through the piece, and I wanted to make it even more versatile by adding a clamp to that threaded rod, so I didn't have to use a ton of clamps to get these attached to the piece. So that is why the hole I'm drilling for the threaded rod is close to where the cabinet will be, and that is because I thought I could use washers on the bottom of the top of that threaded rod and clamp it onto the edge of the piece. So these are all of my pieces. You can see I have 1 miscut, and if you have a plethora of clamps in your shop, at this point you can be done, because these you could put the threaded rod in there and, as you can see, clamp them right to the side. But like I said, I don't have a ton of clamps. So this is just an example of, I had mocked this up already. The problem with the washer was it still wasn't enough of material to clamp onto the side, and even though I got that rod close to the cabinet, it was still offset enough that when I applied pressure to that washer, it was torquing it instead of clamping it. So the second design I tried out was this cleat that hooks on the edge of the cabinet, and that was working to clamp it down, but I made this really quickly. It was just braided in place, and I needed to redesign it to get it to work. And this is what I came up with. I put a dado on this jig so that that cleat can't twist, and then I decided to go with a long slotted groove. I did that even though it was more time consuming, because now I could clamp this to any thickness piece. But as you can see, what I'm pointing out here is, if you have a bunch of clamps, this design will clamp right to your sides of your material, and you don't have to go about making this excess clamping mechanism. My problem was I already don't have a lot of clamps. The miter clamp portion itself is already 4 clamps. To clamp the jig onto the box would be another 4, which means each corner, just to do the miters, would need 8 clamps, and I just didn't have that. Clamps are ridiculously expensive. I wasn't going to spend hundreds of dollars getting more clamps to be able to do that. But if you're a little overwhelmed by the process of this, like I said, you don't have to make the portion I'm making now if you have a lot of clamps. But all I did for this was, this piece is about 5 inches long, and I cut 1 continuous dado through the whole piece, the same thickness of my ply, with a little bit of material at the end, so I have a nice joint there. I don't have to worry about the end breaking off, and then I could slice them into 1.5 inch pieces, and they'll all have the dado in the same spot. Now, to add that groove, there's faster, easier ways to do this, but I'm gearing this video towards DIYers, people that don't have a lot of woodworking experience, and a lot of people will have a drill press before they have a mortising machine, and within reason, because this isn't necessarily a finished piece of furniture, it's just a jig. With a steady hand, you could drill this pretty easily handheld. I'm trepidatious in saying that because I'm sure some people will think that's ridiculous, but I know some people don't have a lot of tools. But as you can see, all I did was drill a series of holes, so I'm essentially going to get a partial mortise in this piece. And then if it was a finalized piece of furniture, I'd clean this up with a chisel, but plywood and chisels don't really go that well together because of the fact I mentioned earlier. The grain is laminated perpendicular to each other, so you get a lot of tear out. So just use my oscillating tool in order to clean up those edges and make it look somewhat nice. So that was pretty quick work to finish up those. that is my row of clamps, obviously 2 per clamp, so 4 per corner. I needed 16 of these. And then I could just put some glue in that joint, add my cleat. This is once again just scrap ply. And this ply I got for the build that I did, it has these brown bits of a couple sections of that ply is brown, and I don't know what exactly it is, but it's a much denser lumber than most plies I'm working with, which made it ideal for making a jig. So I already had those 2 pieces of threaded rod, which was nice. Like I said, I could test out the jig before spending money, but I needed more to finish this up. This is 5/8 inch rod. It's what I had. I was thinking about using 1 inch because 5/8 still has a little bit of a flex to it, but I didn't have a problem with it. And I just bought a 6-foot piece. I could break it into 25-inch sections, and that is most likely going to cover any sort of miter clamping size material I'll have going forward. Like I said, if I'm going to spend time making a jig, I want it to be for something I could use for future projects, not necessarily a one-off. And then the bottom pieces are clamped in place with nuts, and then the top, I have a thick washer on there as well as another nut. The top and bottom are clamped. I didn't have to buy nuts for this because I had these already in my shop. If I was buying materials for this, I would have bought enough nuts so that all of my pieces could have a nut on the bottom of them so they're all in the exact same position. It's not a pain to maneuver them once they're on the cabinet, but it would just be a little bit easier if they were all in a set position. And then I could finish off the top the same way I finished off the bottom, and that is essentially the setup I ended up with. So once you have this, it's really easy. It just clamps right onto the side of that cabinet. Obviously, in order to get those cleats in place, I had to lower my piece a little bit, but then I could twist everything in place, hand tighten it. I don't think I filmed this, but these required using wrenches to tighten all these nuts. Otherwise, they still kind of wanted to slip on you, and then I could just align all of my pieces. Now, this is dry fit at this point. It's not final clamped. And then, like I said, you could see how that slot would fit on really any size material on the top there within reason. If you have 6 inches or whatnot, that won't work. But I could clamp everything in place, align everything, and now from top to bottom, that entire joint, I have a way to apply that pressure and pull the whole thing together. Now, like I said, if you don't have a lock miter bit, I have a love-hate relationship with those. I'm going to recommend doing something like a miter joint with splines in it, because if you just have a solid miter joint on this corner, chances are, even with these jigs, it's still going to want to slide around on you, because that is just the nature of that joint. The lock miter helps keep everything in place, and then the clamps pull everything together. So I hope this helps someone who is frustrated with this. I've tried other methods before. I know some people like the blue tape with super glue on there. I don't love that method, which is why I came up with this, but I'm interested to know if anyone uses anything different that works for them. But so far I'm pretty happy with how this turned out.